Hello and welcome to this video on how to be a great player. My name is Guy and I'm going to be taking you through the wonderful world of gnomes. How do we play a gnome? What's a gnome all about? Why do we like to play gnomes? What makes them different from, say, halflings? And how is it that we get to understand this little group of people and make them just so much better? Well, do they all have to be Irish to begin with? Or at least that kind of weird little accent which I always use for my gnomes. Why do I use it for my gnomes? Because, well, I'm afraid from television and other influences, that's how I see them. I see them as these bonny wee little fellas. I'm using Scottish words now. It's a disaster. It's a complete disaster. Abandon ship. Abandon ship. Hello and welcome to this episode. Gnomes are an interesting race. And when you look at them within the player's guidebooks, they're all pretty much the same. Short, inquisitive, blow themselves up, happy-go-lucky, friendly, illusionist little weird people who enjoy their lifespan, which supposedly is 500 years or so, but generally doesn't make it past the 200th year because they've ended in a rather exciting and yet failure of an experiment or a concoction or a device. Gnomes are a very interesting people. Very interesting people within the realm of fantasy. And the reason for it, we get lots of different types of gnomes. Rock gnomes, forest gnomes, under gnomes, sky gnomes, all kinds of weird and wonderful creatures. And they've gone through the range of having purple and green and pink hair to regular hair. Gnomes really have run the gamut, but they have remained fairly consistent. As I said, they are a people who delight in exploration, in adventure, in illusions, in machines, in alchemy. They are a very inquisitive people. Now, what's important, at least in my opinion, is that there are two attributes which we as players can look at to really embrace the gnomish spirit. And the one is that they have strong familial ties. They live as these little clans, as these groups that work together, that live together, that share their experiences together. In the Dungeons and Dragons book, they talk about the fact that the parents, the mother, the father, the uncles, the aunts, the grandparents, each give the child a name at birth, so that gnomish names can generally run to 7 or 8 or 12 separate names as awarded by each of the adults within the clan. Then, of course, once they go to the surface or once they start dealing with other races, they narrow it down to first name, clan name, and nickname, and then they just sort of stick with those 3. And they choose the ones that are the most interesting or the most exciting about it. So the idea here is that gnomes have this strong family base, this strong identity of the group. Now that's very useful to us as players because, of course, our role-playing group, our fighter, our cleric, our tiefling, our this, they become part of that gnome space. So that allows you to create a very cooperative character, a very dedicated character who's going to really want to work with the party because they see the party as being part of their family. Now that gives you so many role-playing opportunities. You can be concerned for the fighter, that the fighter doesn't get hurt too much, but in that kind of bravado way. You can be concerned for the mage, curious as to what the mage is doing, curious as to what the archer is doing. Ask the cleric questions about their religion. So there's all that wonderful, wonderful role-playing opportunities. So that's the first major element about gnomes that I particularly enjoy. And the second element is more in how you portray the gnome. So one of the big things for me anyway, as a player, but also as a dungeon master, is that if my character, let me rephrase, if my player decides to play a race other than human, how do they convey to me a sense of otherworldliness, of gnomishness, of dwarvishness, of halflingishness? How do they convey that? How do they let me as a player or as the game master know what that character is? From that perspective. It's the same question that you have with gender or with hair color or with eye color. But with the race, it starts to become, I think, even more important, and especially with the diminutive races. So when we look at dwarves, when we look at halflings, when we look at gnomes, the short races have a problem. And that problem is, once they step into the height-centric world of humans and elves and orcs and tieflings, everything becomes that much higher. 3 foot is not very tall. With your arms, you maybe can get to 4 foot, which is usually enough to open doors, maybe to open windows slightly, but there starts to become a fundamental problem of height. And I think that in fantasy, that's definitely something that we should address anyway. In science fiction, when you've got a short race, what do they do? Do they build buildings half the size, or do they relish the fact that the building that they live in is twice the size that they normally would build, because, quite frankly, it's twice the size that they would normally build? So how do you convey that to the game master, to your fellow players, but without it becoming tedious? That's the trick. Now, generally speaking, what happens is people ignore it. They simply carry on as per usual, except when there's some curious requirements for a small-bodied person to fit down a small access chute or to sneak underneath a thing. That's suddenly when it comes to play, but for the rest of the time it's usually forgotten. So something that you can look at is, how do you translate that across? Does your character have stilts that they wear to raise them an extra foot in height? So now they're about 4 foot, 4.5 foot. That's getting a little bit closer to humanized standards. Do they have grapplers that they can use to grapple with? As gnomes, for them to invent something like that is not out of the realm of possibility at all. Do they have powered armored suits that allow them to be higher and taller to fit into this very height-centric, fantastical or science fiction-like space? It's an interesting question. If we look at how do we deal with people who do not have great height within our own society, well, we build access ramps, but we don't often see step-ups to counters where your head might be at the same level as the counter. Those are very uncommon, but that's because we have a really, really small population of people who fit into that space. I'm not saying that it's right that we don't do it. I'm just saying that from an economic perspective, that's why it hasn't been done in the past, and callousness, etc., etc. In a fantasy world where you have entire populations of people who are, suddenly that starts to make more sense to do, and if it isn't done, why isn't it done? Speak to your game master or to your dungeon master about these heightist issues and see how they can be overcome. Maybe your dwarf or your gnome in this particular case becomes a champion of height equality or something along those lines. Anyway, the point of the matter is that gnomes are this close-knit bunch of people who are inquisitive, who are adventurous, and who are generally optimists. Again, this is something that you need to bring to the table when you're playing a gnome. Now, I hate tarring every single member of the species with the same brush, but unfortunately the stereotypes are there, so you can play to them or you can play against them, of course. But a grumpy gnome who's very unhappy with life, if he has a beard and a big nose, is really just a dwarf, isn't it? So you need to think of ways to differentiate, and the way to do that, of course, is to look at their culture. What kind of culture does the gnome come from? Speak to the GM to see if they've got thoughts and ideas, and then try and develop them yourself further and beyond that, to again express your gnomishness. Do you want to play up to the stereotype that the gnome is slightly ditzy, creative, blow themselves up type of people? Or do you want to portray them as a warm, loving, close-knit family group who work together and support each other and understand that when there's an explosion, it's probably been done for the best of intentions, but everyone should go and get a bucket of water to put the fire out? So that's something that you can concentrate on, is trying to determine, is your gnome someone who is an optimist and works together with the group, or someone who's had a bad experience and doesn't have those gnomish qualities? Things to look at, or words to describe your gnome, might be fun, light-hearted, serious, focused, open, eager, dedicated, wandering, and a seeker. Those are words that I use. So when I'm trying to make a decision as to what my gnomish character might do, I fall back on those words. He's dedicated, so he's not going to abandon the group. She's a seeker, so she's going to wander down that corridor on her own. But she's optimistic, so she's going to wander down that corridor on her own after telling her party that she's going to do that. But she's fun, so she wrote it on a note which she put inside the pie which she gave to the orc just before she snuck away from camp. So when he eats it, he'll eventually find the note, and then they'll know what's going on and everything will be fine. But, well, there was a little bit of a trick to it, wasn't there? So that's a way of playing the gnome. Now, the idea of giving the gnomes a fast speaking voice is because in the books it describes gnomes as being so eager, so excited about everything that's going on in the world that they can't articulate it fast enough. They can't get their thoughts out of their head fast enough. That's exhausting to play. But you can have these bursts where the gnome suddenly runs around as if they've drunk 4 liters of coffee and they really, really want to do stuff and they can't get it out of their heads fast enough. That's one way of playing it. Another way of playing it is that they just spew out ideas, idea after idea after idea. This requires you to have a very agile mind in terms of being able to just deluge your fellow players in thoughts and ideas. But it certainly brings across this very unique character who's got so much energy. They just need to get it all out, but they can't. It starts to create a very interesting race that happens to be there. Now, I say go to the Dungeon Master to talk about the culture, the space that the gnomes come from. I would also exceptionally, and that's the wrong word, I'm like a gnome now, I'm trying to think 5 sentences ahead. I would also emphatically suggest that you chat to the Dungeon Master or to the Game Master and say, how do gnomes behave in your world? Do you use an accent? Maybe you can't do accents. But do they speak quickly? Is there a way that you portray them? And then try and embrace that. There's nothing worse than being a player and deciding, well, in my head, gnomes are, they stutter, or they have a German accent. And then the GM starts to play the gnomish community, and he's made them all Australian. Or he's putting on a French accent. There's a disconnect which doesn't sit well because you've got one idea and the Dungeon Master's got another. So I would try and align those, speak to the Dungeon Master and see what it says. Now, if you don't do accents, if you don't do performance, that kind of thing, that's absolutely fine. But then you need to start using descriptive words to describe your character who's bouncing with so much energy and running from food stall to this stall to that stall, who's throwing down a piece of parchment and drawing the dungeon in 3 dimensions so that they can have all of their plans involved in that, where they talk about height differentials and how this gnome can strap himself to the orc's leg and move forward as a kind of mobile ballista platform. All these kinds of ideas you then can portray. You don't have to physically enact them or vocally change your voice so that you appear to be more gnomish. That would just be icing on top of the cake, in my opinion. The last thing that we need to look at when we look at gnomes is to determine what benefit being a gnome is. Now, they can just be fun to play. Absolutely, they can be fun to play. But I think that if you look deeper, if you look at the tieflings, for example, they've got those issues that they're dealing with, those sort of 3 very different spaces that they're in, and they've got their own history that needed to be explored. Gnomes don't have that. Gnomes have got much more freedom in terms of the narrative structure. But why play a gnome in the first place? What does it bring aside from the mathematical values? So if you're going just for a maths build, a pure build like that, then I would encourage you to really look at how you can embrace that and bring to life the gnomish character. If you're going for other reasons, look at those reasons and then see how you can support those in the way that you express the gnome. If the gnome grew up as an orphan, maybe they feel like they should belong, but they don't necessarily have anyone to belong to. Maybe they're not the optimist gnome. Maybe they're more of a realist gnome, and they've been ostracized as a result of that fact. There are lots of reasons why one can play a gnome. looking at that gnomish space, trying to get into that headspace of someone who's just so excited about the world, so enraptured with everything that's going on within that space, it gives you as a player a phenomenal platform to explore the world the game master has made for you. She's invested a lot of her time coming up with the campaign setting and languages and that kind of thing. You can now be the player who goes out there and finds the information that she's buried and stuff and relish it and enjoy it. So it gives you a phenomenal opportunity to almost be this 12-year-old wide-eyed wandering around the dungeon, wandering around the campaign, and just enjoying the make-believe space that we're in and just reveling in it and really, really, really embracing what our game is all about, is flexing the imagination and just pushing it to the next level. So Gnomes, I think, offer a phenomenal opportunity for you to get in touch with your inner 12-year-old who originally started playing Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder or whatever system you started with, because it was so cool and so different and so exciting. You can rekindle that initial passion. And that's what I think Gnomes bring to the table. Anyway, until next time, I wish you and yours the very happiest of playing.